Church at the 21st Century. And we have with us as our guest this morning, Dr. LBaldwin, to talk about how the African American church has changed over the last century. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, let me welcome you to the show this morning.
Thank you.
To tell you how delighted we are to have you. But as I say each time, that you've been with us so many times, and to talk about your background, your education, and your experience. I'm sure that all of our members of our audience understand who you are and the many, many, many books that you've written and your scholarship and et cetera. But for the sake of the audience, the sake of those few who might not know you, let's have you to give us some information in reference to your background, your education, and some of your experiences, and then we'll get into the change in face of the African American church at the 21st century. Let's do it from that perspective.
All right. Thank you so much for inviting me here first, and it's great to be here in during Black History Month.
It is.
I grew up in Wilcox County, Alabama, Camden, Alabama in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Deep roots in the African American church, particularly Southern Black Baptist Protestantism. I matriculated at the public schools in Camden, Alabama in the 1950s, and graduated from Camden High School in 1967. And of course, from there, I matriculated at Talladega College in Alabama, was there 4 years, ultimately receiving a BA in history from Talladega. From there to Crozer Theological Seminary in Rochester, New York, where I received the MA in 1973 and the MDiv, Master of Divinity, in 1975. And from there to Northwestern University, where I was awarded the PhD in American Religion in 1980. So my educational pilgrimage has really occurred very much in connection with the Black church. Both are inseparable as far as I'm concerned, in terms of my own development.
As a matter of fact, did you at one time say that your father was involved in preaching? Did you tell us that?
Yeah, that's right. My father was a pastor in Wilcox County, Alabama, or Butler County, Alabama. He also felt that his ministry related very much to civil rights. So he was a force in the Black church in Alabama.
Very good. And so let's talk about the African American church, Dr. Baldwin, and to sort of start us off at the period of slavery. I mean, you know, we talk about the African American church and et cetera, but during slavery, Africans did not have an organized institution as a church. But nevertheless, they did have, speak to it from that perspective.
Exactly. In the South particularly, now you did have in the antebellum North the development of institutional Black churches, but in the South, we had essentially the invisible institution of the slaves, where they met in the woods and the thickets and the ravines to worship their God and to give expression to their spirituality. So you had in the South the invisible institution, and in the North the more visible institutions in terms of the institutional church. But in the pre-Civil War years, we know that Black religion developed along both lines. But after the Civil War, you get, with the Emancipation Proclamation, you get the freedom of African Americans in the South, and then institutional church developments began to occur throughout the country. So since the period of Reconstruction, I think we can speak of the Black church as a national phenomenon, spilling over into the North and the South. And that institution, of course, has taken on structural form and also a sense of mission since the Reconstruction period.
And so the African American church that we're going to talk about today has a changed face in the 21st century. Why don't you, and I guess we're getting ready for our second commercial break, but when we come back, what I'd like for you to do is to look at the face of the African American church before it changed, and use this 8-minute segment, talk about that church. And then after the second commercial break, to talk about the second African-American church, using all of the scholarship and individuals and et cetera within the framework of both of those churches. And so we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.
And how scholars today are viewing the church.
And we'll do that during the last 10 minutes.
Oh, okay.
And so that'll give you an opportunity to use names, associate some names and activities and et cetera with that area. And then after this second break, then we'll come back and we'll deal with that last part for the last 10 minutes.
Okay.
You ready? Yes, ma'am. Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for the morning. The topic is the changing face of the African-American church in the 21st century. And the guest is Dr. LBaldwin. And Dr. Baldwin, let us see if we can pick up at this point and to talk about the African-American church before it changed during the 21st century.
Now, we know about that church largely through the scholarship of some of the pioneers like W.E.B. Du Bois and Carter Woodson, Benjamin E. Mays and Joseph Nicholson and E. Franklin Frazier. Now, Du Bois published the first history of the Negro Church in 1903, and it used the tools of social sciences to critique the black church. Du Bois looked at the black church as a social institution, and I think his scholarship had a great influence on those scholars who came after him. Du Bois publishing the Negro Church in 1903, Carter Woodson comes along in 1921, publishes a book on the history of the Negro Church, and in 1933, Benjamin Mays and Joseph Nicholson published the Negroes Church, and in 1963, of course, E. Franklin Frazier published the Negro Church in America. And they all were concerned about how the black church functioned as a social institution. That black people could go to these institutions to feel a sense of racial unity, to feel a sense of their own personhood, to develop some sense of mission in these churches. But the argument in that first, among those first group of scholars in the 20th century was the black church, that the black church was essentially social. Of course, Du Bois and Carter and E. Franklin Frazier were sociologists. Carter Woodson was a historian. E. Franklin Frazier was a sociologist. So we can understand that the stress at that time was on the black church as a social institution and how it met the needs of black people. But there was that critique among these scholars also that the black church had not done enough to address the social, economic, and political problems confronted by blacks. So this scholarship occurred during that period of the traditional black church. We can talk about the new black church later. But the argument also focused around this question of just how involved the church was in civil rights activism. You take people like E. Franklin Frazier and W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter Woodson, they felt that the church had much to be desired in terms of its activism, that it was primarily responding to the religious needs of the people and not really responding appropriately to the social, economic, and political needs of the people. So that was an argument during that time, and we know that the life of the black church in the first half of the century, and perhaps certainly in the first half of the century, of course, proved that, because you had a kind of de-radicalization of the black church in that period from 1890 up to 1955, and Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr., came along in 1955 with the involvement of the church in the Montgomery bus boycott, and of course we noticed the radicalization of the black church.
And the change in faces.
Exactly.
It's moving away from a social organization.
Yes.
Now it's more a political, it's becoming a political organization.
Exactly. More of a political organization, more of an organization that is involved in the total needs of the black community, particularly economic, social, political. And of course, the civil rights movement had a great impact on the changing face of the black church. That was one point at which the face of the black church changed, because Dr. King made the church relevant in the struggle for civil rights. He drew on the prophetic tradition of the black church and applied that in his civil rights campaigns. So that was very, very important in the mid-1950s. So we see a different church from that we recognized in the period from Reconstruction up to 1955 when the Montgomery bus boycott started.
And so in a real sense, the church, while it changed, how did people react, did African Americans react to the change in face of this church?
I think the African Americans on the whole, particularly those who were church connected, reacted quite well, because what Dr. King did and others who were involved in his Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the 1950s and 60s, they made Gandhi relevant, because many of Gandhi's ideas coincide very much with New Testament ideas in the Sermon on the Mount. Love your enemies, turn the other cheek. So Dr. King and others in the South in the black church had already been exposed to the New Testament teachings of Jesus, so that made them more receptive to the teachings of Mohandas K. Gandhi. So I would say that African Americans responded well to this changing face of the black church from the mid-1950s up, when Dr. King drew on the church as a kind of social and political platform, as a de facto platform for the civil rights movement. Black Americans responded quite well.
Very good. And so in a real sense, Dr. Baldwin, that the church, while it might not have been a political, economic, and social organization in the first instance, it still had to deal with social, political, and economic issues.
Problems, yeah.
And how did this church deal with social, and for example, during this period, lynching might have been a very, very important consideration. The KKK and all other kinds of organizations.
Exactly.
How did this first church respond to?
Well, it depends on who you read. If you read, for an example, Gayrod S. Wilmore, who's written a very important work on African American religion, he argues that during the slavery period, the black church was very radical with people like Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, and others. He argues that the period from 1890 to 1955 was a period of de-radicalization. So he makes that argument. But if you look at E. Franklin Frazier, he argues that the black church from the slave period up to the civil rights movement had a predominantly otherworldly outlook and was not so much concerned about the issues and concerns of this world.
But the last statement in reference to that was that the black church might have responded to how society that it was in would anticipate it responding to. In other words, they could not do political things primarily because the society that they were in did not allow for political things. You know
I think that happened with most churches. Gayrod Wilmore argued that most churches up to 1955 were Booker Right churches.
Okay, well, hold it and hold that thought, and we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. There you are.